The Jedi, the OG space wizards that hold laser swords that took the world by storm, fighting their eternal enemy, the other space wizards, but their laser swords are red. This video will be an official follow-up to the red laser sword wielding evil space wizards video that you guys requested I make a Jedi version of, so of course this will be Legends canon rather than Disney, as I feel that's the most fitting way to follow it up. I might make a Disney canon version of both in the future, but for now this is just Legends. Unlike the Sith, who are really stingy with calling people Sith, very exclusively, usually only 2 at a time, if that, the Jedi just kind of make everyone a Jedi. There's, and I'm not joking, probably hundreds to possibly thousands of them in the Star Wars franchise in total. Due to that, I can't include every single Jedi in this video, so this one instead will be all of the top main Jedi, ranked from weakest to strongest. Sorry if that upset some people, and if you're hoping I'd give some random background Jedi that died during Order 66 with no name some scaling, but nobody has time for that. Regardless, enjoy. In I tier, yes, there's I tier. Starting with I tier, we have Vodo Boss, effectively a Yoda archetype within the Tales of the Jedi comic series, set a few thousand years before Episode 4, A New Hope. Vodo was able to do battle with Exar Kun, being able to sustain many overhead strikes from the saber-wielding Sith Lord, before being ultimately defeated. The Sith ranking video we did a little bit ago explains pretty well how Exar can be a complicated character to scale. However, he's most consistently below the likes of Darth Malak, which should explain his placement by the end of the video. The Sith video that I did prior to this, which I'll leave in the description as well, really acts as a companion to this one, as obviously the dynamic of the Sith versus the Jedi more or less informs the overall power hierarchy of the verse. Appropriately, both the protagonists of Knights of the Old Republic 1 and 2 are in the same tier of power. Revan's best scaling as a Jedi, and again let me say, as a Jedi, is being above the Starforge-empowered Darth Malak, which was implied to be the source of his greater than Exar Kun level power on the Wizards of the Coast website back in the day, placing him above the likes of Vodo, who is more or less relative to an earlier Exar. Also, the Knights of the Old Republic remake trailer, which yes is canon to the Legends timeline according to the members of the current Star Wars continuity team, states that Revan is the greatest Sith in generations, which would include Exar, seeing as Exar only died 2 years before Revan was born, and Malak then states that a Jedi Revan is stronger than the Sith Revan he trained under before losing to this more powerful Revan. From this point on, all Revan does as a straight-up Jedi is get bodied by Vitiate, and is kept in stasis until he shows up in Star Wars The Old Republic as an angry dark side zombie dude, not a Jedi, who then pretty much immediately dies after having his light side spirit merge with his dark side body, or something. So if you were looking for maybe some higher tier Revan scaling, it's probably going to be in the Sith ranking video. Revan as strictly a Jedi just doesn't even really do all that much in the lore overall, and for sure doesn't represent his peak in power. Mainly his real top tier scaling would be if you think Exar Kun is extremely overpowered, which I go over in the Sith video again. Especially compared to his novel appearances where he's seen channeling both light and dark side powers, or his MMO appearances for example, still an iconic character worth including. Mitra Surik would be in this tier as well, as Kreia, someone who trained Revan, stated that Mitra was the strongest student she'd ever taught. The way this statement is framed likely means Kreia is referring to her students' lives holistically, which would include Revan. Even if his feats against Malak are at a time when he is no longer Kreia's pupil, still, Mitra has a pretty point-blank statement of being directly compared to Revan, as the Emperor's Wrath referred to them both as the Jedi's greatest heroes, so she would still probably be in a similar tier of power. Now is probably the best time to discuss the Hero of Tython. However, the story here is much the same as in the Sith video. When it comes to MMO characters, the scaling can vary wildly based on what story paths are chosen by the player. It's also true here and throughout much of this list that his peak is likely not when he is a Jedi. The hero is a possible candidate, again if the player deems it so, to take the title of Outlander, which would scale him above Revan from his novel. As shown in the Sith video again, at the end of the day, the hero is rather hard to play, so just like the game itself, I'll leave it up to you guys to decide where exactly he scales. I mean, your Hero of Tython could unironically be stronger than someone else's after all. Starting off with G tier with Qui-Gon Jinn, who is actually insanely impressive when you break him down. He was able to match Darth Maul's strength while off guard on Tatooine, and was also able to put up a fight against Maul later on, even having the upper hand on the Sith assassin at points in the fight. Keep in mind as well that the Jedi hadn't actually fought a Sith in around 1,000 years, and on top of it all, Maul was actively suppressing Qui-Gon's power through the Force, so the entire time, Qui-Gon wasn't actually fighting Maul at his best. Kind of a monster feat when you consider it. Again, watch the Sith video to see how powerful this Maul, someone who considered Jinn a worthy opponent, really is. But for now, just know that Maul should be stronger than the likes of early Ventress and Darth Malak through various statements, such as Savage's first real feat ever being Season 3 Ventress level, with Dooku still stating this Savage is yet to reach the power of Phantom Menace Maul, and Maul's battle on Naboo being proof that the Sith are deadlier than ever, as well as much more evidence as presented in the Sith video. Seriously, just go watch that video already if you haven't. Speaking of that video and Sith in general, something that I saw a lot of people misconstrue was the nature of the Rule of Two and the Sith's growing power in general. This is actually relevant because this applies to Darth Maul, who we just mentioned. Some cited how many Sith seemingly use sabotage or trickery to defeat their masters, and therefore wouldn't be stronger than them upon their death. However, what those detractors overlook are the statements themselves, as well as the will of the dark side. The statements about the Sith growing in power over the generations is actually definitive. This verbiage doesn't actually allow much room for alternate interpretations, if any at all. There's also the fact that when Sidious killed his master Plagueis through deception, he felt the dark side actively anointing and empowering him after his death. Not to mention that Darth Bane's literal force power transferred from host to host, no matter who or how the next Sith killed the preceding one. Saying the Sith grow in power due to the Rule of Two isn't just saying that the master trains his apprentice to be stronger than him, it's that the dark energy within his master transfers to their student upon death, no matter what. Consider that Sidious was considered to be perhaps the greatest expression of the dark side of all time, someone valuing subterfuge and secret decade-long plans to achieve his goals. The dark side certainly values these things and would likely grant power to whoever resorts to these methods to make them more powerful. The statements blatantly say the Sith grow stronger every generation, stronger than Darth Bane, who was stronger than any Sith before him, etc., etc. So Sith Lords are generally more powerful as time progresses within the Star Wars universe itself, with very few exceptions. This is important for the Jedi, as I mentioned earlier, as Jedi fight stronger and stronger Sith Lords. With that cleared up, we then have Sin Dralig, the Jedi Chief Saber instructor during the Clone Wars, should also slide into this tier based on a statement made by Count Dooku in Labyrinth of Evil, which implies he's around Episode 3 Obi-Wan level. So he should be above the likes of Phantom Menace Maul, seeing as Obi was able to hurt Savage with physical strikes, which is as true of Asajj, who prequel era Obi also scales to, and Savage at that point was confident he could beat Darth Maul. Likely assuming he's at the level of power he showcased around the Phantom Menace, but was shocked to learn that Maul himself grew massively in power. Meaning that at this point in the Clone Wars, Obi physically stacks up to someone who is likely stronger than Maul, who he only beat prior due to the Sith underestimating the then Jedi Padawan. This all comes back to Sin Dralig, who would be a comparable threat to General Grievous as this same Obi-Wan. Eeth Koth was also winning against a very early Grievous and only lost the overall encounter due to getting jumped by Magna Guards. Here as well is Ahsoka Tano, who is Anakin's Padawan. Keep in mind this is Legend, so Ahsoka doesn't have as many crazy feats like fighting Darth Vader or anything like that. It's pretty much strictly just the Clone Wars Season 1 through 6 as far as the ranking's concerned. Unfortunately, this is one of those tiers thanks to the wildly inconsistent scaling regarding Asajj Ventress and General Grievous brought forth by the 3D Clone Wars show. Essentially, for the most part, these two villains are more or less totally different characters when compared to the books and comics of the expanded universe and the Filoni Clone Wars. There are some tools we can use to make sense of it, like Asajj's growing power throughout the war of Grievous receiving cyborg upgrades, but it's still pretty clear that the writers of the books and the Clone Wars had very different ideas for these characters. Consistently, it makes the most sense for Grievous's peak to be towards the end of the war, as he was able to press Mace Windu during a fight atop a moving train, before being nerfed before his Obi-Wan battle via Mace using the Force to crush Grievous's chest and lungs. Essentially, his upgrades at the end of the war brought him towards Mace's level before Mace had damaged and weakened him, so people like Ahsoka and Obi would not scale to peak Grievous. This is the most consistent argument more than likely, but again, Grievous practically has his own multiple lanes of consistency. With that said, Ahsoka scales to this mid-war General Grievous, as seen in Season 5 of the Clone Wars, and would likely be towards the lower end of this tier. Like I said though, this tier features characters who would as well be above Exar Kun, the Jedi Revan, and Mitra, scaling to Darth Maul, who is a deadlier Sith when compared to that ancient Dark Lord. The rest of the tier, besides Qui-Gon, could be lower in spite of that, due to there being various interpretations around Grievous' scaling. Hard to pin down everything on a character who can fight both Mace Windu and a saber duel, and get bodied by nameless fodders. Anyway, the moral of the story is that having a lot of writers on a story, not necessarily all working together at the same time, usually makes things pretty complicated. Anyway, in F tier, we have some of the higher end, yet not really top tier Jedi, like Plo Koon, Kit Fisto, Kiari Mundi, Saesee Tiin, and Agan Kolar. The bulk of these warriors being masters comprising Mace's select task force assigned to kill Darth Sidious, and should therefore scale above someone like Sin Dralig and the likes of F tier, seeing as Sin was on Coruscant and would be able to help Mace defeat Palpatine. Mace just must have figured he'd be better off with these guys rather than Sin. Kit Fisto is likely among the highest of these ranks, considering he lasted the longest against the most powerful Sith Lord in history up until then, at least compared to the rest of the team's said Mace. Towards the end of the Clone War, Kiari Mundi was actually considered to be in the upper tier of the Jedi Council along Mace and Yoda. While upper tier may be referring to something like wisdom or influence, if it is in reference to power, something Mace and Yoda obviously have in spades, this is a pretty nutty statement which could put Ki at the top of this tier. Although he was kind of jumped by a bunch of clones while looking right at them, which is, yeah. Plo Koon would as well fit in here, seeing as he is stated to be one of the most powerful and dangerous Jedi ever at the point of the Revenge of the Sith. He as well could scale above Kit Fisto directly, as he more or less performs better against the bounty hunting Dirge when compared to the Nautolan Jedi, which wouldn't contradict Mace choosing Fisto to help him out, as Plo was off-world. If anything, it likely just means Mace would have picked Plo to help him as well if he were on Coruscant to take down Sidious. And speaking of Mace Windu, Darth Maul actually held Plo Koon in a similar stature to Mace, as he considers them both truly great Jedi warriors. Even more to point, in the Clone Wars lightsaber duel video game, Anakin mentioned that word spread of Plo defeating Yoda in lightsaber combat.
I heard you're one of the only Jedi to have ever beaten Master Yoda in a duel.
It was likely a spar and not an all-out duel, but still an insane statement regardless. But again, we have to keep in mind consistency, and there's simply far more going for those in the tier above Plo Koon when power is concerned. Also, did you guys know Plo is actually a master of Force Lightning, having perfected a variant of the technique born out of a great sense of justice? We know the Sith variant is something that requires greater effort from even the strongest masters to deal with. It's a pretty potent ability for Plo, if you think that's at all true for his version called Electric Judgment as well. Around here is likely where we'd place the rest of the Jedi Council, as they are stated to be the best or most powerful of the Order. However, many of them don't really ever do anything of note, but could be around this or the tier prior based on those statements above. Take it or leave it really if you just love all the characters on the council for some reason. In each tier, we start to get to some really heavy hitters, such as Mace Windu, Yoda, and Anakin Skywalker. All three of these Jedi share various statements at multiple points in the prequel era of being the most powerful Jedi in all of history, which once again sort of enforces that earlier statement I made about Maul, the Rule of Two, and the ever-increasing Sith powers, and should thus scale above the lower tiers on this list by these statements alone. Starting with Mace, many people downplay his defeat of the Sith Lord Darth Sidious by assuming Palpatine through the fight. However, based on guides blatantly stating that Mace can and did outright overpower Sidious here, it's not actually a valid argument. Not to mention that Palpatine's weird spinning scream was actually stated to have nerfed or weakened Mace and his squad, so it's actually an even more impressive feat in Mace's favor than how it looks on the surface level. While it is true that Vapad redirects dark energy back to its host in Legends, meaning Sidious's dark side attacks would have actually empowered Mace in this fight, this is a standard ability Mace possesses and would certainly be a factor of his practical strength within the universe. Vapad is a very useful ability to have when the near sole purpose of the Jedi is to defeat the Sith, so if we're ranking top Jedi, perhaps one of his Jedi abilities to fight Sith should probably be considered. Also, even without these feats, Mace is still considered to be among the top tier Jedi of the time, and the strongest Jedi throughout of all of time up until Revenge of the Sith, just like Yoda and Anakin, with statements of being rivals to or even straight up equal to the Grandmaster's power. One shouldn't forget as well that while Vapad can be used to redirect dark power, Mace rarely ever does this, if at all, before the Sidious fight, with the Revenge of the Sith novel stating that Mace fought the Sith Titan with no Jedi restraint, and was so submerged in Vapad that he no longer truly existed as an independent being. All this implying that this probably isn't what a normal fight with Mace looks like, and he probably has never used Vapad like this in combat before, so any guide statements or comments made about Mace's power within the universe itself saying he's, say, Yoda level or whatever, probably aren't actually taking into account this single use of Vapad, as outside of this one battle, all Vapad does is enable a Jedi to fight with ferocity bordering on dark side use, like a controlled rage boost. So if anything, if you include Vapad, his statements would only be amplified, they wouldn't be different. When it comes to Grandmaster Yoda, he has various statements of being the most powerful light side user up until Revenge of the Sith, while having feats of beating Mace in formal combat in the past. While some might point to the fact that Mace pretty objectively beat Sidious, whereas Yoda lost, it's actually stated that Order 66, as well as Anakin's descent into the dark side, made the Sith Master more powerful, meaning that the Palpatine Yoda lost to is simply stronger than the one whom Mace defeated. Anakin profits off of these peak prequel level Jedi statements as well, one among them being the fairly famous quote from the Revenge of the Sith novelization, saying that Anakin is the fastest, strongest, and unstoppable warrior, the best there is and the best that ever has been. In fact, just prior to the events of Revenge of the Sith, Anakin was stated to be as strong in the Force as any Jedi who had ever been on the Jedi Council. He then handily defeats a going all-out Count Dooku.
That's always another thing that's been discussed. I mean, Palpatine isn't protecting Anakin ever. He's trying to see how powerful is he. When Anakin is strong enough and destroys the Count, or if he's too weak and the Count destroys him, defines his kind of status.
Right.
Someone who would have been a master equal to Yoda if he hadn't left the Order, and was already equal to Mace Windu as a Jedi prior, with Sith Dooku showcasing feats relative to Yoda and Mace Windu during the Clone Wars. After this fight, and thus after Anakin grows even stronger, it is stated that Anakin is more powerful than any Jedi Yoda has ever known before. It should also be noted that any statements of Yoda being able to handle Dooku easily and during their encounter is of course not stated in Legends canon. In Legends canon, the statements are a lot different about the difficulty of the fight. This is all very consistent, especially when guides have asserted that Anakin was already Yoda level in power as early as Attack of the Clones, clarifying that he simply lacks the control over that power in comparison to a wizened Grandmaster. Control that he evidently would have achieved through an entire war's worth of combat. There are simply far too many statements claiming Anakin to be the strongest Jedi ever during this time period to ignore. Coupled with the feat of Anakin killing Dooku, someone who is relative to Yoda and Mace, as well as a Sith who have given both Jedi a run for their money, it's enough to at least put Anakin in this tier, if not at the top of it. One might ask where Episode 3 Obi-Wan is, since he did technically beat Anakin. However, Anakin was stated to be nerfed during their fight on Mustafar in more ways than one. He was stated to be between worlds or conflicted, not being fully in either camp, light or dark, in the Rise of Darth Vader novel, meaning his overall force powers would be weaker overall in this fight. He is also uncharacteristically fighting kind of apish, not paying mind to his defense during the duel. He was also just crying before the fight and kind of having an eternal crisis over all his recent actions. He then freaks out and chokes the one person who's allowed him to justify those deeds. He even loses his Sith eyes before fighting Obi-Wan, and only gets them back by the time he's already burning alive, pretty much visually depicting that he's not as strong or committed to the dark side as he was just prior. And he was even still giving Obi-Wan the fight of his life and only lost the duel through his overconfidence. But don't worry, because Obi-Wan actually appears later on this list. And funny enough, you can go pretty far with this tier depending on how you want to stretch certain statements, such as Yoda and Sidious's fight being called the greatest Force duel in 1,000 years. We don't know who fought exactly 1,000 years ago, but this is the greatest since then. Or Anakin being stated to be at his absolute peak of power during Revenge of the Sith, with both of these statements referring to events set after the Mortis arc of the Clone Wars, which could, in a way, scale these three above the straight-up embodiments of the Force. However, this is probably not the case, as the son and daughter would have destroyed the fabric of reality if they did battle outside of their pocket dimension of Mortis. And considering there's even a movie set after Yoda and Palpatine's duel, that's not to say no one in Star Wars ever gets to that level outside the Mortis trio, just probably not these guys at this point in the series. Starkiller, a fan favorite Sith apprentice turned clone Jedi, known for his visually remarkable displays of Force power, Vader's secret apprentice would likely rank above these prequel era top tiers via his scaling to Darth Vader just before A New Hope. As described in my Sith ranking video, I'm going to show that about 30 more times during this video. Vader, through training and harnessing his hate, was able to grow leaps and bounds more powerful than his Jedi counterpart, and while Starkiller's defeat over Vader has some context, such as the fact that Vader underestimated Galen at first, which would have likely contributed to his loss, just like it did kind of with Obi-Wan, it's still a very impressive feat considering how much stronger Vader's become since his days as a Jedi Knight. The reason why this places Starkiller above the prequel-era Jedi is due to Vader's monstrous improvements since Revenge of the Sith. Case in point, Carvastor was a foe of Mace Windu, stated to be stronger and faster than Windu himself on his best day. Less than a year after Order 66, Vader was stated to vastly outclass Vastor in every way, meaning even early on, Vader was stronger than those who rivaled his own power as a Jedi. Vader then constantly grows in strength pretty much all the time, reaching many new peaks in power from then on. If you take the Disney canon or the current canon, it gets even worse as Mace didn't even use Vapod to originally best Sidious. However, in Legends he did, but you get the idea. There's also a very interesting showing regarding Yoda, wherein sometime before the events of A New Hope, had a day-and-a-half long fight with a dark Jedi stated to have all of Vader's power, but none of his control. Now, that exact timeline placement of this event is contentious due to a number of retcons, once again, lots of writers. However, it seems to be consistently depicted as being closer to the events of Revenge of the Sith, and not too far into Yoda's exile on Dagobah. This is very good scaling for Starkiller and pretty much everyone else above him on the list, as we know via the Anakin guidebook statement mentioned, Skywalker in Attack of the Clones can have every bit the power of Yoda, but would be pretty much fodder to him due to not having a control of that power. Or another example is how Anakin can go from easily beating Dooku by Revenge of the Sith, someone could sling around and KO Obi-Wan, to ultimately losing to that same Obi-Wan, mostly due to a lack of control over his emotions. Essentially, being out of control is a massive nerf even if you have monstrous Force power. This is especially impressive for Starkiller if the Vader compared to this Dark Jedi is one set around the time of the event itself, rather than peak Vader as he was in Return of the Jedi, as the statement itself was made many years after Vader's death. This would basically mean that Starkiller fights and scales to a far stronger Vader with more 17 years worth of training and power growth, compared to a far less experienced and unbalanced nerfed Vader that Yoda essentially fought for over a day straight. It also needs to be said that the original Starkiller was stated in Star Wars Insider number 100 to have potential equal to, if not greater than, Luke Skywalker, who is someone with possibly more potential than even the Chosen One, and has his limits constantly surpassed through Vader's ruthless training. even grows stronger through Force Unleashed 1 as he learns more about his true origins, and not hard to imagine why this guy is stronger than the prequel heroes. The matter of the fact is, the clone of Starkiller, as seen in the Force Unleashed 2, is stated numerous times to be above his original version, with this stronger Galen Marek being weaker than Vader, who has now experienced the original Starkiller's power and learned from his initial mistakes. Vader was as well not trying to kill Galen, seeing as the clone was the first near success in a long line of failures, with Vader quote-unquote losing this fight through a combination of being attacked with his guard down, as well as his damaged suit's exposure and weakness to Force lightning, something Vader and his life support systems are expressingly vulnerable to. In terms of outright power though, this 1 year before A New Hope Vader is clearly more powerful than Starkiller, impressive enough for D tier regardless. In C tier, we have Old Ben, or the older Obi-Wan Kenobi. Old Ben is actually probably stronger than his younger counterpart for a number of reasons. For one, it was stated in the A New Hope Junior novelization published in 2004 that Obi had lost no measure of his power since his youth, meaning he hasn't become any weaker in the years since Revenge of the Sith. We also know that the Jedi Master was actively training on Tatooine at least 2 years into his exile, being able to adapt to the planet's harsh climate rather quickly, so there's no reason for him to necessarily be weaker than he was as a younger man, unlike the Disney canon Obi-Wan Kenobi TV show. Dooku, Yoda, Sidious, all men who reach their primes and force powers long after in real-life person meets their physical peaks. What likely proves Old Ben is outright far stronger than his past self is also his performance against Darth Vader. Like I said regarding Starkiller, Vader was stronger than those featured in E tier very early in his career, and by A New Hope, he would be as well stronger than he was when he overpowered the strongest Jedi Starkiller in the Legends timeline. There are many varying statements informing the first ever lightsaber battle shown to audiences. At the end of the day, we can come up with a few interpretations. Either Obi-Wan is point blank a match for Vader and allowed himself to die, or he could fight Vader for a time but ultimately grew too fatigued to continue the fight and used his inevitable death to teach Luke a lesson. Or Vader considered Old Ben weak and represented an absolutely unwinnable obstacle to the aged Jedi Master. Depending how one chooses to combine or parse all of this information will likely determine your personal placement. However, it is more than likely the case that Old Ben at least somewhat scales to A New Hope Vader, even if it is a losing fight and Obi would eventually run out of steam. This would scale Obi above Starkiller, someone who was pretty definitively on the losing side of a fight against a weaker form of Vader, as Darth Vader has many statements of pretty much constantly growing in power. Of course, he's stronger than he was as Anakin, as shown in the Sith ranking video, and he has statements asserting that he is at a new peak of power in A New Hope, so much stronger than he was when he pretty much beat Starkiller. Remember too that Vader gets even more powerful after his fight with Old Ben, so Obi doesn't quite scale to peak Vader when it's all said and done. Again, however, there's a lot of information that could prove to be outright contradictory without a lot of legwork to make sense of it at all, so your mileage may vary with the old Obi-Wan scaling. In B tier, we have Kip Duran, Kyle Katarn, and Leia Organa Solo. Kip Duran was a Jedi who, as early as having his power first felt by Luke Skywalker, was directly compared to Yoda and even Old Ben. Kip would of course grow stronger over the years, which would scale him above C tier. Leia, nearly 30 years after the events of New Hope, was stated equal in power to Kip, and Kyle Katarn, famously the protagonist of the Dark Forces video game series, as well as the Jedi Saber instructor of Luke's Jedi Order, is directly compared to Kip Duran by Luke Skywalker 40 years after A New Hope. While fighting a Sith, Luke states that Kyle Katarn or Kip might be a match for the Darksider, and even brings up a physical and mental strength as a component of the comparison, meaning the two Jedi should be relative at this point in those faculties. Mara Jade, Luke Skywalker's wife, was at first tasked killing the Jedi, with Sidious in his final words instructing the Emperor's Hand to take Luke's life. Sidious, of course, be privy to Luke's power, with Luke being stated stronger than Old Ben as early as Shadows of the Empire, placing Mara above C tier. And while Vader was conflicted when Luke bested him via his Rage Amp in Return of the Jedi, it is still impressive that Palpatine figured Mara could kill Luke after witnessing this display. Mara was as well able to outmaneuver and ultimately kill a deranged and enraged clone of Luke, with the clone being relative to Luke himself just prior. This is only Mara's initial scaling as well, and she has about 30 more years of training and power growth on top of this. In A tier, we have Jaina Solo and Jacen Solo, the grandchildren of Anakin Skywalker. Jacen, later known as the Sith Lord Darth Vader, shouldn't be too far off from the power of his dark self, seeing as he had already undergone the bulk of his development, that being a 5-year training arc, learning from various Force-based religions, with statements even around this time of being among the greatest of Luke's Jedi Order, being able to use the Force as well as any other. It should be fair to at least scale the once-in-future Darth Vader to, if not above, Jedi like Kip and Leia. In Fate of the Jedi Apocalypse, pretty much the last depicted event in Luke Skywalker's life, it was stated that Jaina Solo had proven herself as being equal in combat to any other Jedi in the Order. Keep in mind as well that this statement was made 3 years after Jaina struggled to beat Darth Vader, which isn't really an anti-feat either, as the Sith could do battle with a bloodlusted Grandmaster Luke, and was getting closer to Luke's level of power every day. So in 3 years' time of training, Jaina gets to a level where she could as well effectively combat Luke Skywalker, at least Luke as he typically is, which is a suppressed fighter as he fears channeling his true power and risking using the dark side, which would still allow Jaina to fit in A tier, and perhaps at the top of its pecking order, she is the Sword of the Jedi after all, which is essentially the new Jedi Order's version of the Chosen One. Grandmaster Luke Skywalker in S tier probably speaks for itself, but for those that don't know, he is a character with a long legacy of being one of the most powerful beings in the entire franchise. He was already stated to be stronger than any Jedi in history during Empire Strikes Back, while being directly compared to Obi-Wan, Yoda, and Anakin Skywalker. He stated stronger than ever before a year after Dark Empire, logically including his Leia amped self, who was able to defeat the strongest form of Darth Sidious of all time in said comic event. Sidious is arguably the de facto most powerful Sith ever, bear in mind. During the Vong invasion, one of the later periods of Luke's depicted life, he was called the most powerful Jedi in the galaxy, which would encompass all members of A and B tier at some point. On top of all that, Luke is someone who is constantly holding back, weary of using his full power after being turned to the dark side during Dark Empire, meaning it's possible that Skywalker's true upper limits are yet to be actually unexplored. To further compare Luke's power to those featured in A tier, Luke was able to ultimately defeat Darth Vader in a pitched battle and refused to combat him again out of fear that he would kill his nephew. Vader, while under the persuasion of the dark side, was able to pretty much fondle a Jedi task force including Kyle Katarn, who Vader could parry in his sleep, quote-unquote, in his own words. Meaning Luke would pretty much be able to dominate half of Tier A, except perhaps peak Jaina Solo and Jacen if you think he at least mostly scales to his Sith counterpart. For the fans of the bona fide protagonist of Star Wars, here's your guy. Anakin Skywalker with his full potential unlocked, as seen in the Mortis trilogy of the Clone Wars. On this planet, a place where the Force flows strongest, Anakin was able to dominate the embodiments of the dark and light side themselves, being shown and stated to be even more powerful than Abeloth, someone with 12 times the power of Grandmaster Luke Skywalker. Now, while Luke was able to defeat Abeloth with the help of Darth Krayt, a Sith relative to Luke in power, her death came at a time when her avatars across the galaxy were being killed off, which likely nerfed her. This is a worthwhile distinction to make, as the ones were stated to be more powerful than Abeloth herself, being capable of imprisoning Abeloth over and over again, forcing her back into her black hole prison for centuries. Many fans of Legends tend to overestimate Abeloth's power, citing how the father had to save the son and daughter from the embodiment of chaos, as the two looked afraid and sullen when faced with her. However, based on the statement from StarWars.com, as well as the context surrounding this instance as well, it's likely that the son and daughter were simply emotionally reacting to their surrogate mother's horrible transformation. Keep in mind that the two legitimately loved their caretaker. I think all of us would probably look pretty afraid if any of our parents turned into this all of a sudden, even if you think you could take them in a fight. So essentially, Anakin at his best can bully creatures stronger than someone a dozen times more powerful than Luke Skywalker. Of course, this would only be on Mortis, ignoring the possibility of Luke also managing to tap into the Force Nexus if he were to pit these characters against one another on the planet itself, since that's where Anakin achieves this great power. Luke has statements of having at least similar, if not greater, potential than Anakin, and should have far greater skill and control than his father, at least as he was in the Clone Wars. But again, Anakin on Mortis, when he's at his best, is stronger than Luke's ever been in the series, besides possibly the hypothetical Mortis-amped Grandmaster Luke, which doesn't actually exist. While Anakin, as seen in Revenge of the Sith, was already featured on this list, we figured we'd add full potential Anakin here, since him versus Grandmaster Luke, or full potential Luke versus full potential Anakin, is actually often debated about. Hope that clears it up, and I hope you guys enjoyed the video.
And as a final closing note, I would like to thank my good friend Crisis for editing this video, and also really helping me out with a lot of the Star Wars Legends information, lore, and scripting of this video. He's been a huge help, so if you like that kind of stuff, be sure to check it down below. In the future, we are planning more ranking videos together, so be sure to look out for that in the future. Thank you.